So for the last panel, the fourth panel for today, the topic that will be addressed is the international collaborative responses to cyber incidences. The panel chair is General Michael Hayden, Principal Chertoff Group, former Director of NSA and CIA. General Michael Hayden became Director of the CIA in May of 2006, capping a career in service to the United States that included nearly 40 years in the U.S. Air Force. He served at CIA until 2009. Earlier positions for General Hayden include serving as the Director of the National Security Agency and Chief of the Central Security Service. He was also the first Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence. When he used to come and brief at the White House in that position, a number of staffers, including myself at the time at the White House, used to refer to him as, "Here comes P. Diddy." And he actually had a good sense of humor because often he referred to himself as P. Diddy. I've known Michael Hayden for a long time. When I was at CIA and he was at NSA, I think he's one of the most important thought leaders we have, even though he's not in the government any longer. When he certainly was in the government, he changed the nature of what NSA did in its business after 9/11. And I saw that from the White House as we watched 9/11 happen. And it was Michael Hayden that came in and showed the world and the United States what could be done in order to protect ourselves from terrorists. Since then, he has also become deeply involved in the cybersecurity aspects, and that Chertoff Group has been doing just that, to push the thought leadership on these issues. So I've said, would you please be the chair of our last and final panel and not let anyone rest and get too tired and have some very thought-provoking things to say. Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Catherine. Thank you for those very kind words, and thank you so much for the opportunity to chair a panel at 4:40 in the afternoon after a very intense day of intellectual engagement. Well, as Catherine said, the broad topic for this panel is international collaboration. And frankly, I find that, and I'm very happy that I was selected for this particular panel, because I find that very intriguing, and even in my own experiences at the two agencies. You know, what does international collaboration really mean? We're all creatures of Westphalian thinking, Westphalian frameworks, Westphalian structures, Westphalian mindsets, and we're taking those tools that we've inherited and trying to apply them to a domain, to a universe that is boundless and borderless. And I must admit, I was involved in a variety of conversations as to what does the clash of those two thought processes, Westphalian and the lack of boundaries, mean for concepts like sovereignty. Is it ended? Is it limited? Is it unchanged? And then when you even look at the question of international cooperation, our language traps us into prior patterns of thought. I mean, we native English speakers use international almost synonymously with global. But if you look at the root of international, it's between nations. And frankly, I don't know that we can conclude at the beginning of our conversation that we're talking about collaboration between nations as being the most essential kind of global cooperation that we're looking at. So in an almost pernicious way, our language captures our thoughts before I think we've really engaged ourselves. So there's an awful lot to be discussed here, and I'm quite heartened to see that we'll probably be picking up a few of the threads kind of left in the air by the last panel, and I fear we will leave our own collection of threads hanging in the air at the end of this panel as well. We've got a wonderful panel. Let me be very brief in introducing the folks up here with me. Mr. Andrea Rigoni, Director General of the Global Cybersecurity Center in Italy. The Right Honorable Lord Reed of Cardowan House of Lords, also of the Chertoff Group and former Home Secretary in the United Kingdom. Mr. Perrin Wang, Visiting Researcher, Faculty of Law at the Vrije University in Brussels, and also PhD candidate at East China Normal University in Shanghai. Gavin Reed, Computer Security Incident Response at Cisco. Mr. Jan Prisalu from Estonia, who served as head of IT at Hansa Bank. And finally, Dr. Greg Rattray, partner in Delta Risk. We'll all come to this problem from where we have been. You'll see a variety of national perspectives, national lenses here. I look forward to the interchange, and I particularly look forward to the questions and the discussions that follow. So, Andrea?
Thank you very much. So, thinking about international cooperation, I focus my attention on the national component. Unfortunately, my center is based in Italy. We have a research center that we established 2 years ago. Is an example of a country where the general awareness on cybersecurity is quite high, but the government doesn't have yet a national cybersecurity strategy. So with many countries in the world that are a critical part of the global system, interconnected without a national strategy for cybersecurity, it's very difficult for these countries to address properly the international dimension. Now, I want to focus a little more the attention on this problem because it will help understanding how we can engage eventually these countries. And I'm using not only the example of Italy, but of many other developed and developing countries that are in a very similar situation. So the cybersecurity for many countries is not today a top priority. With this I mean that when they declare the importance of cybersecurity, they understand that it's important, but at the end, when you look at their political agenda, cybersecurity is not there. And if you look carefully, this is also true for the European Union, that right now is addressing cybersecurity, but as one of the components of the European digital agenda. And I will come later to this point because the coordination in incident response is one of the elements of the agenda. So one of the problems of these countries is that they're not able to figure out which is the right level of attention and the right level of commitment and the right level of investments for cybersecurity. And some of these countries are not able today, for example, to measure the impact of cyber attacks. So if I take again Italy as an example, Italy, 99.4% of the companies are small and medium enterprises. And for these companies, it's very difficult to monitor cybersecurity. So they do not report cybersecurity incidents, and I'm quite sure that most of them are not able to detect a security breach. So how a country like Italy can properly measure today the impact on the Italian economy of cybersecurity attacks? So how can they have the right weight in order to devote the right attention to cybersecurity? Looking at the international dimension, I think that here international cooperation could help. I think that there are countries like US that are very interested in keeping a healthy collaboration with many countries because in cyberspace, US provides a lot of the internet services. I'm considering, I mean, in most European countries and not only in Europe, most of the digital services are provided by US companies. If I think of the top European digital providers, we are talking about Amazon, eBay, Google, Facebook, Apple. These are not European companies. So that's another reason why international cooperation should start from raising the awareness of these countries, maybe sharing some data. Maybe sharing some intelligence with them in order to help them understanding which is the real risk they are facing. When we come to incident response, this is a direct consequences. I mean, the incident response should be part of a mature defense strategy, in particular in cybersecurity. You need to protect your assets, you need to protect your infrastructures, but then you need to be ready to detect any anomalous activity or any breach. And the real successful organization is the one who is able to limit or null completely the impact of an incident. Now, most of the small and medium enterprises do not have an incident response capability. Most of the large companies have a security operations center or a computer emergency response team, but international standards in this area are not yet mature, so we are not able to say if these capabilities that both public and private organizations put in place are adequate. And even more interesting is that the cooperation between CERT is not very broad. That's why this is one of the priorities of the European Union. So one of the actions of the digital agenda is to first of all, invite all EU member states to have a national CERT, and for a national CERT, they mean a central point of contact for both the public and the private sector. That for the private sector should be also the front door to the government. And also that they have to establish connections with a coordination entity in Brussels. And also, I think this coordination entity should enforce building a full mesh network of connection between the CERTs. Now, where these CERTs are failing is the connection at national level. Most of the, my center did many research projects in this area, and we saw that most of these CERTs have a one-way communication. So from the CERT to the constituency, government or private sector. Most of the feeds are coming from multinational companies, so they buy or they get access to open source databases, or they get the information feeds from the private sector. But the other way around, in most cases, does not work. This model is also implemented in developing countries. There is a strong push from the United Nations to help developing countries to establish their own computer emergency response teams. I know of at least 25 that have been built between Asia and Africa, and it's built on this model. We are proposing on these at first to test at national level a two-way communication with the constituency. So we have seen some pilot projects that were started just a few months ago where these computer emergency response teams, they see the active participation of both government agencies and the private sector. So the employees of the CERT are provided in part by the constituency. And this is helping in these pilot projects to create a tighter connection between all the entities involved. As soon as this model works at national level, connections between at international level should be implemented. Now here there's a problem. CERTs, sometimes national CERTs are very generic organizations, and some of the issues are very specific and tied to a specific sector. Just to mention, I mean, problems that a bank is facing are quite different from the problems of a transportation company or a utility. Some sectors have a more natural approach to cooperation, and mentioning utilities, they are already used to work together. There's not a tight competition as in other sectors, for example, the financial sector. So I think some of these examples should be used to develop new cooperative models where there is a real exchange of information coming both from the private sector and the government. I want to finish using one of the remarks of the previous director of CPNI in UK, and he told me, so they established very successful information exchanges many years ago, sectoral-based, and he said the way we have been able to engage the private sector, but not only the private sector, also the government agencies, was to start giving them real valuable data. That's the way we use to ask for information. And after many years, I think they can say that this model was successful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Roderick?
Thank you, Mike. As Mike said, I had the honour of being a minister in Tony Blair's cabinet 9 times over, 9 positions. Every time he had a problem, I seemed to be the solution. And 4 of them covered the area of security. But I want to make plain right at the beginning, I'm not a PhD in computing. I'm not a PhD in electrical engineering or any other form of engineering. I suppose there's an upside to this. I'm not a PhD in sociology either. I am a PhD in history. And this morning, when Melissa Hathaway referred to Minerva, it struck me that if you could stand it at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I would start with a quote from a German philosopher, Hegel, who said, "The owl of Minerva spreads its wings only at the coming of the dusk," which is why I'm a historian, because wisdom comes from hindsight. And I asked myself the question in the course of today, in 50 or 100 years' time, when people look back at our deliberations and have to write a book on what we knew about cyberspace, what would they say? And they would certainly say, we did a lot of things. And they would almost certainly say, we did a lot of talking. But if they were asked the question, yes, and what was the purpose of the things? And what was the subject of the conversation? What was the concept? What was the intellectual framework that framed the strategic moves forward? What was the doctrine? I think the book would be a very small one indeed. And that is what I want to refer my remarks to today, so that I don't impinge upon the expertise of those of you who are technologists or are specialists in that area. I want to mention a couple of words that haven't been mentioned a lot. One is resilience and one is doctrines. And if you can bear with it, I have 4 slides, no more than 4. If we can move on to the first, please. First of all, I want to mention 2 words which are on our title for the panel. The first one is international, and the second one is incidents. On international, let me just repeat what Mike has just said. Sovereign bodies will remain powerful. There will be bilateral discussions. But cyberspace, if I can use that word, is a transnational environment. It is not just an international one. And transnational bodies, whether it be anonymous or AQ, swarm throughout it, even as we speak. They won't wait for the establishment of an international treaty or international institutions that take decades to fully function. We need something that promises speedier delivery and incorporates the capacity for constant innovation. Secondly, on incidents, I'm reminded that the British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, who came through some tough times and several near wars, was asked what he feared most about being in government. And he said, events, dear boy, events. Incidents, exactly. In cyberspace, the plurality of incidents will be increased to the factor N in our cyber environment. Crisis, properly defined, and I will come back to that, crisis will not be abnormal, they will be the norm in the cyberspace environment. There won't be any business as usual. There'll be no complete control of cyberspace. It's not just a medium. It's not just a means of communication. Personally, I'm not even happy with the latest phrase that has been used about a central nervous system, because that insinuates that it is somehow domestically incorporated. There is a huge existential matter to deal with in cyberspace that is far beyond any one central system. In a sense, it is an environment. It is the first man-made environment. And albeit man-made, it has returned us to a sort of state of nature, just like the sea or space or air. Rear Admiral Cox earlier on referred to the Portuguese and the Spanish Empire developing mechanisms, technology and laws of the sea. I would remind you it took some 3 centuries to develop the law of the sea, and only because 2 powerful bodies, the French and the British, controlled it, did they manage to impose that law. It is rather more difficult with nearly 4 billion people who are empowered by the internet rather than 2 bodies. So we're dealing with a new environment, and not only is it transnational, it is also diffuse. It is deep. It is empowering people down the way. It means a mistake by a corporal is now a strategic mistake rather than a technical mistake. In every office in the country, there is somebody in your institution who, if he commits an offence that would have committed 50 years ago, would not have affected the strategic outcome of your private industry, it will now have a strategic effect in it. And thirdly, the third characteristic, it is changing by the second. So if we go to slide 3, please. Here in the home of a renowned legal establishment in Georgetown, I have to warn against what I regard the trap of legalism. Not because I don't believe in the rule of the law, I do. I've been a legislator for many, many years. But because I believe that there is a subversive effect of the cyberspace environment which renders all of our inherited laws, institutions, culture, and even diplomatic relations between countries impotent to a less or greater extent. And unless we get the profundity of that change as leaders in industry and in government, then we're not going to find the focal point around which we can build international collaboration. Changes to historic circumstances create a disjunction between the inherited culture, laws, institutions, and methodology in the way that they did, for instance, when new forms of conflict gave us the crisis, and I call it a crisis, with the Geneva Convention regulations, because they assumed a defined war between defined parties lasting for a defined time, after which we would have a defined arrangements and defined release of prisoners, and everyone would go home. We've seen the inadequacy of that, which raises the huge problems surrounding Guantanamo Bay, surrounding control orders in the United Kingdom. Similarly, the cyberspace environment renders all of our old methodology more or less impotent. Doesn't mean to say we shouldn't be patching up technologically, doesn't mean to say we shouldn't be trying to patch up legally, but it will not give us the central focus in order to get collaborative alliances of like-minded people. The law in itself is now challenged by a transnational environment populated by nearly 200 sovereign bodies. States and IGOs, intergovernment organisations, therefore have a 5x5 legal array to contend with in peace and war. This rests in our assumption on 4 Western schools of jurisprudence in various states of obsolescence: classical, natural, Marxist and positive jurisprudence, all or are withering. But the ideals of normative justice in which we operate in our legal system mean nothing to rising powers elsewhere in the world. And yet we're dealing with a transnational phenomena where countries far away from the United States and the United Kingdom and Europe will be empowered by the new cyber environment. So what I do today is not in any way to criticize attempts through conventional methodology to address this problem, but I do warn that it may lead us into a trap and a bit of, if not a cul-de-sac, at least a very, very long road. I remind you, it took something like 60 years to get the START Treaty on strategic weapons, and that involved 2 major players, not 4 billion. So you can see the difficulties of getting a treaty or a law or a culture by diplomatic means by using the old methodology. So I believe that we need a more realistic and fast involving way of doing this. And I introduced 2 things. Next slide, please. The concept of resilience to crisis owes its heritage to earlier understandings of networks in the national security communities, including that in the United States primarily and the United Kingdom, not least on the idea of net assessment. I want to introduce that in the briefest terms. There are 2 things I want to say. Crises are not catastrophes. Crises properly defined are turning points for good or for bad. That is the Oxford Dictionary definition of a crisis. And secondly, resilience doesn't mean bouncing back. Resilience has to mean the enduring power of a body or bodies for transformation, renewal and recovery through the flux of interaction and the flow of events. I've got it up there from the Palgrave Dictionary. I agree with that, not least because I helped draft it from the Institute. So it agrees with my prejudices. But the important points about it is resilience is not an engineering definition. If we only bounce back during and after a crisis to where we were before, we will not keep pace with the innovation that is inherent to the new cyberspace environment. And therefore, learning becomes the important thing. And together, these two words produce a concept fit for an environment that faces incessant change. Next slide, please. The power of that concept becomes evident by developing doctrines to accelerate learning, avoiding the perils of misperception and self-deception. The military people here will know what doctrine means, and the jurists may know what it means, but let me just explain for those who think it means doctrinaire. It means the opposite. By doctrine, I mean a set of flexible, pragmatic, and empirically based guiding principles to shape our response to unanticipated events or phenomena. Doctrines are used by, but not the monopoly of, the military or jurists or strategists. And the idea of the doctrine is critical to enabling collaboration when incidents cascade and mutate in cryptic combinations throughout networks. And here's the point. Declared doctrines, that is the development of a doctrine which is declared openly, would facilitate not only the domestic discussion around some of the issues which obviously differentiate and divide opinion in the United States, but also bringing together capabilities across coalitions, perhaps in the first instance coalitions of the like-minded. It would not only be a speedier form of international collaboration, but also allow the possibility of much more rapid coalition building than has been present in the last few decades. So in closing, I'll just mention quickly 3 characteristics of such a doctrine. First, in an environment beset not only by known risks, but by uncertainty, decision-making has to be distributed, so as not to overwhelm and discredit would-be competent authorities. However, inasmuch as distributing risks and decision-taking is virtuous, assuming competencies will organise is rash. Doctrines enable the learning of competencies. 2, while the decisions need to be taken rather than contemplated, decisive actions needs real capability options. And the acquisition of capabilities as evolving ecologies of competencies and technologies can be better organised and more productive, but few bodies, states, firms, NGOs will be self-sufficient. That is why we need to do that together, right across the international community and right across the sectors. And finally, and crucially, the most important of the lot, underpinning all of what I've said will be the capacity for innovation. Decisive action, even during crisis, only buys time to learn. And unless the capacity for innovation is brought to bear in any incident, the likelihood is that there will be no option but to take a more costly turn for the worse. Time for learning must not be squandered. Innovative, entrepreneurial, driven change is one of the central key features of the cyberspace environment. Anything which impedes that, and there was some references earlier on to that, is, in my view, something that ought to be looked upon very carefully indeed. Anything that enhances entrepreneurial, innovative thought. It has implications for the way we recruit people in the public sector. It has implications for whether we should subsidise big industries or small, medium-sized industries. In other words, 1 or 2 persons to allow them to flourish, to succeed or to fail quickly. So the doctrine itself and the concepts has also some practical implications. But my contribution today is basically to say, unless we get that conceptual framework, I believe that if we go down the road only of treaties, only of bilaterals, or only of the illusion of an international law which will cope holistically with the cyberspace environment. Unless we put something that places a focal point for that collaboration, we will minimise our chances of succeeding. Thank you, Michael. Cheers.
Mr. White?
Thank you very much. Hello, what happened? Oh. Today, my presentation including such sections. One is the China's mechanization mechanism of the cybersecurity. On the cybersecurity this shore in China, it was put forward in the 1980s. The first book is the left. Its name is the title of the book is Information Warfare. The author is Mr. Shen Weiguang, who has an office. A military officer in PLA. The second is unrestricted war, and the cybersecurity is an objective of national strategy in China. There are two official state documents. One is the State Information Development Strategy from 2006 to 2020. It was ensured by the China Communist Party Central and the State Council. On the cybersecurity and development in China, China government lists two kinds. One is a capability, one is an institution. From the institution, we can find there is almost about 16 departments involved the cybersecurity, meaning MIIT, Ministry of Industry and Information and Industry Department, and Ministry of Public Security and Ministry of State Security, even the military. But there is no evidence to prove China has a trans-department mechanism on the cybersecurity. So I think maybe it's completed the management mechanisms. The China has no current the strategy and the policy. It was ensured by the 12th five-year plan on the national defense. China government still emphasizes attached the importance of cybersecurity. Not only the civilian, but also the military. On the civilian and the core capabilities, one is the warfare involves the military. The other is enhanced the information-oriented core capability based on the advanced research and development and manufacture. What's the cyber threat from the China's perspective? The most important involves the military, especially the revolution of the military affairs. The other, including the computer viruses and cyber attack spam system and the cyber responses constitute the threat to the national security. And how to realize the cyber security? One is the construction. The construction involves the security system. One is the other is the master the core technology. Between the technology gap from China and the Western world, the China concerns is since the Western world master all of the technology, once they take advantage of the technology advantage to counter the China's cyber, it's very dangerous for the national security. I'm so sorry. So sorry. So sorry for the technology. And there is an interview from the PR Daily in this February. The professor Zhang Yongfu said, the core technology is mobilized, is monopolized, especially involves the national and military security, which can not be important by or bought. Hence, we must build a robust system, robust basis of core technology with all intellectual property. Master fit our hands. Who is the PLA information technology? Who has the professor at PLA Information Technology University and the National Information, the committee at National Information Commission. In China, we cannot find a law on the cyber security. Even in this at this NPC in this March, Mr. Xu Long, deputy of the National People Congress, and he is the president of Guangdong company China Mobile. His solution is InfoSec law should be based on the clarified speculations, including legislation in sphere of application, InfoSec concept, scope, supervised administration, protection for system computer information, Internet Information Service, e-business security, information gather and utilization, and ledger responsibility. And the department related to the cybersecurity. Comprehensive is the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, and the Ministry of Public Security. The second is called 公安部. The specific is so many. The Information Office to the State Council, Ministry of Culture, the State the Ministry of Radio, Film, and Television, Ministry of Education, Ministry of State Security, and Administration for the Protector of State Secrets. This is the National Public Cyber Security Incidents response system. We can say the top is MIIT. On this system, we can say the leadership is the MIIT, and there is who leads the CNCERT. And the Ministry of promotes from the official website. We can I list the function of the MIIT and the Ministry of Public Security. On the legislation of the China cybersecurity, we can trace to the 1994. I think the current fragile cybersecurity in China. One is the Trans Department mechanism. One is the other is from the cyber nationalism. There are negative agenda to China's participation in the international cooperation. One is China's cyber nationalism, and the China's concerns on the cyber technology. The China's diplomacy, diplomacy tab, respecting sovereignty and no intervention, and on the cooperation, international cooperation, China has some dilemma. One is how to find the solution on which are contemporary with international practice and its specific regulation. For the reason of international affairs and the international incident, the China's hike will be inspired by the nationalism to launch the action to the foreign website. There are two books on the China nationalism. One is China Can Say No. The other is China Never Lost in Cyber War. Fenqing is very popular. The popular profile on the China cyberspace. It means angry youngs. It's the the cartoon is there's a profile. One sentence is fighting with U.S. I contribute 1 month's wage. Fighting with Taiwan, the month is the salary is 1 year. Fighting Japanese, I contribute my life. In more recent, China published a book on the China not happy. It's very nationalism. At the same time, there is a counter viewpoint be published in the other book. Who are unhappy in China? And I think there is so many diplomacy taboo for China on the international cooperation with the international community. And China's concerns on the cyber technology. Almost all of the Chinese export concerns the cyber technology's situation. And just as I said, Professor Zhang Yongfu. And China's dilemma. And the Chinese, it's well known China for there is an international bloc in China, and it's on the country the most of state. Why? Because Chinese did not find a way to keep the social stability and protect the speech of freedom. I think in recent 5 years, this problem is concerned by all the related stakeholders. In Brussels, in DC, I asked some expert, could you tell me, do you have the evidence to support your argument? China launched the related events. They said only one is IP address. I lost myself again. I'm so sorry. I think if really it happened, it's demonstrate China's technology level is backward than the Western colleague, because you can track as if you're on the bus. Your pocket was stolen, and the thief was caught on the right hand. What happened?
I don't know, but perhaps we could
Yeah.
allow the other folks to
Yeah,
present and then continue.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah?
Luckily, I did a non-cyber thing, and I printed out my slides here so I can actually see them as I present. A couple of things that came out of the last commercial session that I wanted to highlight, and one of them was talked about here. A couple of things that Bob Dix said. First, he mentioned that we're really not successful in the private-public information sharing. And I'll give you one, I run a large incident response team, and I'll give you one anecdote from that, and that's that during that, what McAfee called the Shady Rat incident, which was purported to be from China, where there was hundreds of different, very broad-based attack, hundreds of different companies, private sector, everyone seemed to see a little bit of action from that particular activity. We, and many others in the industry, noticed it from the very beginning, but we were hampered by classification levels at any level of sharing, at least initially. And then when that broke down, when we could actually share information on that attack, we used the public-private mechanisms that were available to us, but we found that that still didn't really stop a whole lot of people getting hacked. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done in that area, and there's a lot of work to be done in the ability to operationalize intelligence. And I think, if I could think of one thing that we need to do in that area, and that's kind of what my talk will be about a little bit, and that's, we need to care a little more, we need to resource it a little bit more appropriately for the type of activities that we're seeing. Can I go to the next slide? So I'm Gavin Reed, I lead Cisco's Computer Security Incident Response Team. So I'll provide you today a perspective that I've got from the last decade of fighting on one of these cyber battlefronts. I lead this and have done investigations and lead in probably one of the most connected and attacked companies in the world. I spend my day in, day out, working on issues when the best laid plans of mice and men go awry, when we're not actually seeing things like they ought to happen, except, when they've been hacked. And I found that faced with fast-moving, hard-to-understand problems, humans have a tendency to overthink things, and they have some not-so-smart thinking. They have some sort of panic thinking, and Bob kind of mentioned this as well. And they tend to want to look for magic solutions. And I bet in that old day of looking at piracy on the sea, there was a lot of mysticism, a lot of things that actually didn't really help that were used to try and protect against what people really didn't understand. I would say that the whole cyber problem today was both predictable and natural, right? We had countries with areas of large concentrations of wealth and others with less. And my company is a lot more than Bob's, hopefully helped connect these different areas. We created one of the most permeable membranes ever made, the internet, and we connected cash with criminals, spies with secrets, activists with issues, and the world stage as their backdrop. Next slide, please. So it's time we have a serious discussion about our expectations for computer security. We want push-button security. We want to replace IT headcount with technology. Set it and forget it. Next slide. So vendors such as, and I'll take blame here, such as myself, have been happy to sell magic robots that can come in, sit on autopilot and kill all kinds of bad stuff without human intervention, just like this airsoft Roomba. Some of these technologies, in fact, can be very effective. Anti-spam, antivirus, web security, can chug along, do their thing. Firewall's another good one. Independently, very good at improving weak security postures. They target the same problem that everyone has, and they're able to do so by virtue of the fact that everyone has the same basic security problems. Same spam gets blasted at everybody. Same ad servers are used to trick serving malware to whoever comes across it. We've become over-reliant on technology when it comes to managing security and interpreting threats. With security technologies that we deploy, they're very, very effective at common problems, but they don't do so well at detecting human-led multi-partate attacks. Next slide. So let's go back to 1987 in the movie RoboCop. So in this case, the police office of, I think, Detroit was replaced, or potentially going to be replaced with these automated robots. The famous scene in the movie is where the bad guy gives a demo of their new robot. The bad guy in the movie gives a gun to an individual and tells him to pull the gun on the robot. Our robotic cop springs to life and orders the individual to put the gun down. He throws away the gun, but the ED-209, or automatic robot, keeps counting down, and everyone in the room panics. Engineers frantically tearing apart control panels. The ED-2009 shoots him anyway. What went wrong was that they treated that tool as a replacement for a human being instead of a tool used by a human. It's difficult to make a machine that can correctly do the reasoning needed to handle complex situations. I'm going to say that push-button security solutions often fail the same way as ED-2009 did. We set them on autopilot with factory default settings and expect them to handle our hard problems. Next slide. What automation can do very well, though, is act as a force multiplier for your security teams. It's very well suited for gathering data about what's happening on your network. It's very well suited for executing repetitive tasks that your security team needs to do. Automation can be used to create an iterative security process, and out of the box, many of these tools will get a lot of the common known threats. Automation is great when it extends your human reach, not replaces it. Next slide, please. So an idea here is that automatic security tools won't really ask or answer the right questions for you. And I maintain the cyber problem really isn't all that complex. What we want to do is rigorously protect the important stuff. So we don't need to protect everything. We need to decide what is important, right? You could put it to akin to your wallet. People, if they've got their wallet, they put all their money in there and they stick it in their pocket. And if they're working in a bad neighborhood, they may put their hands in their pocket as they walk there to make sure their wallet's there. So work out what your wallet is and protect it. Rigorously protect your important stuff. Ensure for the important stuff you have good attribution, and have people, not magic boxes, checking the efficacy of all that. Next slide, please. So a common question I'm asked on this is, how do you train people to be a security expert? And the short answer to that is you can't really, right? We've found that IT expertise is actually more important for our investigators on our team than hands-on security experience. We recruit the best and the brightest from IT, knowing that they'll know how things work normally. And if they know how things work normally, if they know how applications work and networks work, then they can understand when they work abnormally, they can pick it out. And also, they understand what the impact of their decisions are. If they ask an individual to do something, what that business impact might be to the company. One issue for us here in the United States is that IT as a career has become partially devalued, right? We don't have our best and brightest going into IT with long-term career goals anymore, and that's partly due to that same interconnectability that the internet provided. Next slide. So have we been any good at doing this? I can only use my company as an example. Like, have we actually put the resources and people into place to do this effectively? So using Cisco as an example, I can pick on us. We, in the physical world, really get security. The humans have got that. It's pretty easy. They understand it. They don't want to lose their wallet. They want to leave their wallet in their desk during the day and come back and find it's still there. And so what we've done, we have 574 buildings at Cisco across the globe, and we've staffed about 2,000 people to manage the physical security of those buildings. Now, if you compare that in the cyber area, we have conservatively about 250,000 endpoints, right? And then conservatively as well, we've got about 200 people working on cybersecurity at Cisco. And I talk to other CSIRT teams all the time. I've talked to most of the Fortune 50 and a lot of the Fortune 500, and I'd love to say that Cisco is an anomaly, that we're really bad and everyone's really good, but unfortunately we're at the leading edge of where we've seen investment in this area. So next slide, please. So don't get me wrong, a network that's protected only by automated security products is a lot better off than nothing at all. Left to their own devices, most automated security tools will find many basic attacks. The problem is that these are simple attacks, and they're attacks that really no smart hacker would use. So to recap, problem really isn't all that complex. Verizon just released in their report 97% of the reported cyber attacks could have been thwarted with easy controls. Understand where automation ends and people begin. Look for tools that extend your team's reach, not replace them. and use automation to fight automatic attacks, and use people to protect against attacks from sentient human beings. So thanks, everyone. I'll leave you to look at this picture and work out if you can tell me what's wrong with it. Thank you.
Printing copy is available.
Thank you. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jaan Priisalu. I'm coming from Estonia, and in 2007 I was the head of the IT security of the biggest bank. But starting from the 2005, we inside the bank with the security team, we were able actually to halve each year the loss of the cyber security or stealing from the bank, and so it went to the zero, and I went out of business. So so now I'm the head of the agency that is responsible for our national cybersecurity, and the other thing what we do in this agency is also developing and running the backbone of the online government. And my message to you today is that we should use this technology to automate to save our reaction time and try to fit into 24 hours until we touch this person who is doing the crime. No, when we see also why in Estonia the cybersecurity is important, then in 2010 with this agency we made the audit of the critical information infra and found out that 95% of critical service providers are depending on the IT. In 1/3 of those, the dependency was critical. And in 10% of cases, they didn't have the fallback. So if IT drops, we will lose those services. That's it. And what is at stake in this? You can say that this prosperity, economic prosperity, is quite clearly important to people, and we have very big neighbor who is definitely ready actually to offer the administration service when our own government fails. So we are playing really with this nation, and why I think this is my personal experience. And related to the US, I can bring also two examples. One is this road digital that was recently solved when Mr. Chachin was brought, is going actually to be extradited to the US, and it actually began a long time ago. And then what he did was really actually running the domain name service for the Russian business network, and it took really 7 years. In other case, actually in this WordPay case in Atlanta, the response came within 24 hours, and this guy was caught right away. So he didn't actually have the time to clear his traces. And what we have seen also in the response to the cases is that all the things should be used in the appropriate places. Like the search in Estonia, what we use those search channels for verification whether we have the case or not, whether there is reason actually to use the law enforcement process, because the law enforcement process is really expensive thing. So there is the point actually to use it. Where is the borderline where you cannot actually continue with a cert level investigation? It's personal data. If it touches the persons, then it goes to the police. And I really believe that in this automation we can actually build this, try to make out those kind of air gaps between the people. And today people are talking about the bureaucracy, building the big databases where the things are actually hidden. What I'm saying is simply, let's start actually from the signing of the official documents digitally, and sending them and making the obligation for the people to accept those instead of the images of the papers. Let's make it more secure and automable. And I really believe that we can bring in the technology, and it works. That in bank we were able to find out with the technology the organizers of the denial of service routinely in 7 hours. So your own infrastructure is your best IDS. You cannot buy this IDS from the market. What has the same quality as your own infrastructure. And also with the fishers, we went to the level that we knew actually 3 days before the actual fishing campaign started. So it is possible. Thank you.
Greg, you and I talked before we began that we'd probably have a pretty wide-ranging discussion, but your task would be to pull these threads together at the end.
Yeah, so there'll be no loose ends when I'm done. First, I want to thank Catherine, probably in two levels. First, for inviting me and having the opportunity to speak, but for the yeoman's work she's performed over the last couple of years to pull this conference together. My remarks come in very last at the end of a very full day. I'll try to be pretty brief and avoid sort of repeating others, since there's been so much that's gone before me, and some of my key points have already been stolen even on this panel. So one of the things that I find challenging in my experience, both in the U.S. government, and I had the opportunity to serve ICANN as their chief security advisor for a few years, and work a lot now with global companies, is in America and in Washington, it is hard to be an international thinker. I laud everybody that's spending their time here today, but essentially, if we mean that this is a global environment, we've really got to do some of the things that General Hayden noted, and get out of the notion of Westphalian sovereignty to do some of the things that are necessary. I also do believe from my Air Force experience that states will continue to compete, and there will be things that continue to occur in the environment that will be state-based. So I like the word global instead of international for the reasons that both General Hayden and Lord Reed highlighted, which is it's not all about governments and their interactions and nations and their interactions, but the private sector is essential. This has been much remarked upon, noting Andrea's Rigoni's comments. In Italy, it's U.S. companies, but they're not U.S. companies, they're global companies. If you go to the leadership of Google or Microsoft, they do not think of themselves, while they have certain legal restrictions for certain organizations, they are global companies, and they are serving a global audience. I want to note Microsoft has a global security strategy and diplomacy team, right? That's an interesting concept, that diplomacy is being conducted by a company. But if you think of Microsoft's impact in this area, its impact is much larger than most countries or national governments in the globe. And I think their role in the diplomacy that attends collaboration, and I'm going to turn to collaboration here in a moment, is very important. The other challenge I think that Washington and the United States has, which has been a powerful enabler of the country's success over 2 centuries, is its legalism. Our separation of the private sector from government is going to be proves very challenging, has been discussed all day long, related to getting the necessary collaboration because of our concern over things like antitrust and other aspects of how we separate the state from our private companies. Our ability to compete in cybersecurity is going to have to deal with that, because in other areas of the globe, I observe a much more natural collaboration, Estonia being a prime example, but the United Kingdom, the Japanese, the Germans, around the globe on cybersecurity because they don't feel as bound up by the rules that may inhibit that interaction. So I sort of note that as a fundamental challenge, particularly for the United States. I did want to talk a little bit about collaboration, as the panel is about international collaboration. Collaboration is essential. The internet doesn't even function without collaboration. If you think of the nature of this distributed global network, activity, this cell phone, when I go to a website, is interacting globally when it does that. The operating system, is keyed to use a routing and a domain name system where pieces of that infrastructure are located all over the globe and bits and bytes are traveling globally instantaneously. The governments enter into this with rules and regulations, and when there's malicious activity, the governments may enter in with the activity of law enforcement agencies and national security agencies. But in the great measure, the private sector, at least in Western countries, controls the operation of this very complicated system. And it takes a lot of collaboration. How many people in the room know what the North American Network Operators Group is? And just to sort of raise a hand. So 20%, maybe, that's probably optimistic in terms of the numbers of hands raised. That is a collaborative group of the network operators that just make sure the routing and other sorts of things that hook the network together, function effectively. When things like, I think many of you probably know that there was a sort of a routing injection from Pakistan related to YouTube that had a significant disruptive effect on the global network for a very short period of time because of the informal collaboration in groups like these network operator groups that allowed them to know each other, call each other, figure out which routes were injected the wrong way and reroute traffic quickly. And these network operator groups basically exist in each region of the globe. I note this because there are this sort of effective sort of instinct to collaboration that exists at the operational level of the people that run the networks is something we need to leverage, right? And I'm going to note a few examples of collaboration that I see effective globally, or at least between sets of nations, and then talk about what's good about that, and a little bit about what's bad. So first, I think I wanted to note the botnet takedowns, which Melissa and others have described. I think this shows both global law enforcement cooperation, but I know that the Microsoft team that brought some of the suits also collaborated with university researchers and other security companies, so that this was a very collaborative effort to characterize what was bad and get the legal basis for action, including internationally. So I think those sorts of things are important. I wanted to, I do this with some trepidation with Jan sitting beside me, but the Estonian ability to handle the attacks back in 2007 was largely empowered by the serendipity that the regional European network operator meeting was happening in Tallinn at the same time. So all the guys that needed to sort of turn off traffic from the botnets that were attacking Estonia happened to be in Tallinn and could talk to each other and block that. And that was basically a private sector-led activity. I think the Estonians are a model for, with their cyber defense league and other activities, the nature of the public-private cooperation that's necessary. I wanted to mention the fight against the Conficker worm, which had its successes and its lack of successes, but this was a worm that was going to use the domain name system to propagate. The domain name operators managed to block across 110 different countries the propagation of that worm for a period of time until, given the nature of cyber threats, it started to propagate by a peer-to-peer mechanism as opposed to a use of the domain name system as a mechanism, and that the collaboration that was effective there eventually atrophied in terms of the spread of that worm. But I will note that we did have an effective effort to reach out to the Chinese, and the Chinese network center that runs the .cn domain name system quickly came online and was a collaborator in that network. And then I think probably the last sort of effective collaboration I'll mention is This is sort of one that won't get a lot of press because something bad didn't happen, but many may know that Anonymous threatened to try to take down the root server system of the domain name system on the 31st of March. In the weeks prior, the not very transparent group of guys called the root server operators all got together with their informal network. The weaker portions of the root were massively upgraded with tens of millions of dollars of just-in-time investment. And there was no problem. I actually think there wasn't a significant attack. So what I want to note, however, is unbeknownst to many, that some of these network operating collaboratives do act very effectively to deal with some cybersecurity threats. Believe me, I don't think the cybersecurity landscape is getting nicer. But what I wanted to note is sort of a couple of good aspects of this sort of ad hoc private sector led collaboration and some of the challenges and where governments may fit in. First, these guys run the network. They can adapt and change to the technology in real time. That in a way that governments, don't understand how to process it through organizations. And I, could name names in the U.S. government, national security community. I imagine it's similar across the globe. They also naturally reach globally, like I've noted. They are not bound by the fact that any communication with the Chinese or the Iranians has to go through many layers of bureaucracy. They just pick up the phone to the guy that they know from the network operators group or the ICANN meeting, and they talk to those guys and they go, this is bad, you guys should stop it. And that actually happens fairly often. What's difficult about these things, and this gets to really the role of government, there's a lack of accountability. So if you run a national security agency, and General Hayden and others can comment on this, or you're in the White House or on the Capitol Hill, you want to give the American public some sense of control over the nature of security in this environment, and these public sector collaboratives don't necessarily give you a lot of transparency into why things keep functioning reasonably well. They also many times lack the sort of sustainment and resources necessary. So I'll try to conclude quickly. This is where I think government can effectively collaborate with some of these groups. Government role is enabling. There's an important, not polarized, but vigorous debate about the role of regulation. My sense is let's empower and enable first. I've used regulation in a very light-handed way if necessary. But that you should be trying to permit good activity first, because if there's barriers in the way of that, those are the first ones to take down. And at times, put resources into some of these more effective private sector collaborations, government investment in the private sector's ability to do this. I actually think it'll be money very well spent in terms of, a few $1 million would go a long way compared to some of the, the DoD information assurance budget is estimated at $7 billion, and that's only a small portion of the government's investment in cybersecurity. The thing you get back from it, if you're the government, is some transparency. If you're investing, you can ask for some, insight into how they're doing, as well as I think you need to get more measurement, and we need to have a better metrics around the degree of cybersecurity and who's contributing to those things. So the other thing I think we need to do is draw these guys in. The environment is extremely messy. Sometimes these operators have the best understanding of when bad things start to happen. There's a stability and crisis management theme that's run through a lot of the remarks today. I think the ability of the governments to draw on these collaboratives to understand whether something's sort of an anonymous, non-state motivated, cyber dissonant attack versus this is the activity coming out of a nation state. And the example that comes to mind is the events surrounding the botnet attacks that are attributed at times to North Korea in the July 2009 timeframe. I think we've got to worry about stability and crisis management, and governments do need to figure out the right way to draw lightly but not disable some of these collaborative activities. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks, and I think, sir, we open it up for questions.
Thanks, Rick. Thank you very much. I think because of the size of the panel, Catherine's given us to about 10 after 6 for folks to ask questions, so I'd ask folks as questions occur to them to appear at the microphones, and we'll entertain any and all comers. But while we're waiting for that, I think we've succeeded in scoping the problem here. It's hard, and we've laid down a few markers as to what might be some of the contours of a way forward, and public and private, and perhaps not overemphasis on governmental solutions and so on. Boy, there are a million questions that come to mind, but one that strikes me that might be useful is, where do you think the next useful conversation takes place to move this forward? I mean, let me give you one and reject it, all right? When we get into a crisis with regard to nuclear weapons in the Persian Gulf, somebody calls a meeting in New York, all right, and gets 168, 170 of our best friends together to discuss it. Obviously, probably not a good venue for this. But given what you suggested about what governments can and can't do, how some of the cooperation that's essential appears almost spontaneous from the outside, if not so from the inside, the importance of the private sector, where's the next place where serious folks get together to try to make more mature some of the ideas that we've laid out here? And I'd welcome any comment.
Well, I suppose we're all going to, we'll all place our bets. I think, first of all, the worst time to do it is when we hit a crisis. So, if something occurs in the Gulf or somewhere else, and you get lots of politicians will immediately call lots of conferences, and they will come together, and there'll be sort of instant reactions. It follows logically from what I said, according to my views, that we have to do a lot deeper thinking about the question of the intellectual framework, the principles on which we establish strategy, doctrine, and so on. If I had to pick one, I think, and I'm not obviously a member of the Conservative government, but I think that William Hague's initiative last year in London was worth doing. What came out of it was a lot of practical things regarding international collaboration. For instance, things like, I don't know if you have an equivalent here of what we call yellow pages in United Kingdom. It's where all the local tradesmen are, so if you need a plumber, you know where to phone. If you need a cab, you know where to phone. If you were the subject of a cyber attack, who would you phone in Britain? If you suspected France, for instance, just to unite everybody. If you suspected France or someone in France was carrying out a cyber attack, I would know that you phoned the Prime Minister of France, because they've actually given him overall responsibility for cyber issues. It could be any one of 6 in Britain. And I mean, that's not my words. That's the words of the minister who was asked this question at the London conference. So actually, the establishment of points of contact, a very simple tactical level, things like that came out at the London conference. But more importantly, Mike, the thing that came out of it was William Hague saying, look, I think these are the 7 principles on which we should base international discussions and collaboration. I'm not saying they were the right principles. I'm not saying we got far down the road. But I think it was the beginnings of a discussion. It will be obvious from my prejudices, I do not think that you'll get a treaty. Treaties are fine. I do not think you'll get a legal, international, transnational legal solution for the reasons I explained, although you will get it in areas, the Budapest Convention and others. Everybody's against paedophilia, so you'll get it in areas like that. But dealing with the problem holistically, the establishment of principles, and from that, the openness domestically to discussion and internationally to discussion through the formation of doctrines. And I think the nearest I've seen to it is the follow-up conference, the London conference, which I think is in Budapest this coming year, isn't it? Yeah. Sorry.
Gavin, if we construct this magic Rolodex of points of contact, kind of the yellow pages for cyber events, would you confine the individuals, the points of contact to governments, or would you put international entities in
I
there.
should have made that clear. Sorry, that conference, although it was convened by a politician, included academics, institutes, I think Cisco would have been there, and the private sector as well. And nobody had to commit to anything in advance.
Yeah, it really gets to, Interpol does now twice a year a really good private-public sector partnership. It is an invite-only one, and it's really driven by law enforcement's need to collaborate across the globe. And so various law enforcement departments that find that their bank has been broken into and stolen by people in a different geography find that they need that construct. And that need is actually pushing, maybe tail wagging the dog, but it's actually pushing these sort of agendas and these relationships that are much more effective than theoretical ones that are talked about but not really enacted. So, maybe the two shall meet at one point, the sort of operational and the legislative. Again, I'm not even sure that that's what's needed at this point. I don't think that I think that kind of misses the point. Really what we need is people to care a little more. When they care just as much as they care about physical security, then a lot of these problems go away. They're really not, it's not like we need some magic legislation to fix it. And certainly I'm a big proponent for, letting, prosecutors, district attorneys be able to prosecute crimes. I'm not a proponent at all for legislation that locks us into an outmoded model of trying to protect things that quickly gets lapped by the adversary. So I'm not sure that that conversation needs to happen as once. It's going to happen across many points, and it's going to be driven, unfortunately, to Lord Reid's remark, by necessity and need and people losing money.
I was struck by the comment in the last session, the government's focus on process. Their measure of merit is, have you followed the process? Where the private sector moves forward?
I just do not agree with that at all. Yeah, governments are bureaucratic. God knows, I condemned my own department when I took on as Home Secretary to put it out there publicly. I thought it was so bad. By the way, private companies aren't brilliant either. So let's get rid of that. But the key difference is the one that was mentioned here of accountability. On questions of protection of privacy, protection, security of individuals, the government is the people that are looked to, and in democracies you have to be open and transparent and accountable. I actually think ministers have two careers. One is doing what is necessary, and the second is, for the next 10 years, answering inquiries about why you did it. And I've now done one in Iraq, Afghanistan, rendition, there's one in the Leveson inquiry coming up. But that is a measure of accountability which is not the same as a private company has. So that is why there is, people say, no, we've got to think this through, we've got to take it. Now, added to that, yes, as Scott said, there is a bureaucratic burden because nobody gets sacked for saying no. Yeah, I mean, have you seen the British television series called Yes, Minister? Yeah, well, it's not a comedy, that's a documentary. I mean, so there is an element, because we expect our civil service in Europe, not so much here when 10,000 people leave when the president comes in. Over there, when I left, 4 people left with me. When Michael Chertoff left, it looks as though the whole of the Homeland Security Department left with him, and John Chertoff. Yeah. Because the British civil service and European civil services are there to provide continuity. So asking them to do radical change the way that people whose whole life and instincts depend upon it in the private sector is very difficult. But we also bear the legitimate burden of accountability. So,
thank you. We have some questions. Sir.
Yes. Well, Lord Reid, I really enjoyed your framing the question with the transnational. It seemed to me that you first dismissed the possibility of collaboration, and then with your doctrinal approach, laid the framework to develop it, So I just wanted to inquire as to, what sort of an architecture are you thinking in terms of this transnational kind of approach? down the road. I presume you're not dismissing it entirely out of hand, but you're looking a few years down the road. There's a possibility for this kind of thing. So that's kind of
Right, I'm not dismissing collaboration out of hand at all. What I was saying was I think the most effective form of speedy, and by speedy I don't mean tomorrow, but the most effective focal point for potential collaboration was through the development of what we call doctrine. That is a series of flexible principles. Sure. A, because I think you look at this transnational, it's wide. You look at the diffuse empowerment of billions, it's deep. You look at the constant innovation, it is changing every day. And a bit like God, it's everywhere. And a bit like God, we stand in awe of it and we say, well, where do you start? There's not even three persons to start distinguishing, you know? There's just this thing out there. So we all go off and we technically patch up and we legally patch up and the politicians politically patch up. But where's the overall conceptual framework? Now, there are several you could aim for. One is an international treaty. One is international law. And for reasons I outlined, I don't think they will work. Yeah, not in my lifetime, not even my son's lifetime. I may not have that long, but, and therefore I was suggesting that the way in which this could be approached as a focal point, as a handle on this whole thing, is for us to do what we would do if we were jurists or strategists or military people confronted with a series of potentially unanticipated events of new. We would go beyond drills, you know, not marching up and down, that's necessary, but into a learning process and a doctrinal process, which isn't doctrinaire, a set of principles. Once we've done that domestically, simultaneously we should be talking to others, perhaps like-minded nations, about the similarities in their doctrine, and it will give us something that is potentially achievable. Final point, when we got to deterrence, we got there because of a doctrine. It was called mutually assured destruction. Now, it was very difficult. It took 60 years for that doctrine to lead to a treaty, the START Treaty. It was nothing compared to the difficulties of cyber, because there were only two parties in it. There were the Soviets and there was the United States, effectively. Now we're dealing with 200 sovereign states, none of whom have a sovereignty that has not been undermined, democratic governments as well as Hosni Mubarak, by the nature of the diffuse power of the internet. So doctrine I was espousing as a form of potential collaboration that's speedier than any other way I can think of.
well, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Another question here.
Yes, my name is Daniel with the School of Foreign Service. Just had a question. So in the United States, we've seen a push with the creation of Cyber Command, and I was curious the international response that you may have seen to this new command, whether it's copycats or whether there's pushback on it, kind of the international reaction to it.
Let me start, since I'm on the American side and I was the director of what preceded Cyber Command and Joint Functional Component Command Net Warfare. It is a remarkable thing, and we talked a bit about this at dinner last night, that the leader, as we're developing doctrine and how we should think about this, frankly, within the American government, the leadership in American doctrinal thought right now, and for reasons that are probably not accidental, is the Department of Defense. You heard from Secretary Lynn here earlier today. He has the seminal article on American thinking on things cyber. It appeared in Foreign Affairs now more than a year ago, and I tell audiences the most important line in that whole very good article, the most important line is the one under the title. It says by William Lynn, Deputy Secretary of Defense. It wasn't the Deputy Secretary of Commerce, wasn't the Deputy Attorney General, wasn't the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, it was the Deputy Secretary of Defense. And so American thought, maybe by an accident of history, maybe by where we find ourselves more broadly, globally right now, has got a very strong Department of Defense flavor to it. That's happened in the past. I compare what we're doing now with the last great era of globalization, which was European man's discovery of the Western Hemisphere. And an awful lot, interestingly enough, of what happened then was in the private sector, East India Tea Company, Hudson Bay, for example, acting a lot like states and having diplomacy. and frankly, armed men coming forward into a new frontier. Now, that's not determinative. I'm just saying that there's a parallel there. And so there we are as Americans. I am really curious. I think this is a great question. What impression does that make, has that made, in other countries? So let's go from right to left. Andrea?
In certain countries like Italy, and Italy is not alone, this instillated at least the question if the Department of Defense in our country should lead cybersecurity. And one of the arguments that they are using is not only that the Cyber Command here, but also that in many countries, most of the investments and most of the capabilities are in defense. If we look, for example, at most of the most advanced computer emergency response teams that we find in these countries are in defense. And also another argument that they use is that they are more used to international cooperation thanks to the NATO, and so they know how to cooperate on security at an international level. So these are the arguments that I've heard.
Very interesting. Marguerite?
Well, I certainly have no problem with Cyber Command, and I was interested this morning in hearing the outline of the various 4 components of it. But it's also worth adding that, of course, in terms of lots of cybersecurity, the Department of Homeland Security has been put in charge. And also worth noting that the assumption is they can't do it without the support of the intelligence agencies. And I've no doubt there'll be other elements of the US government which are involved in some way. So I wouldn't like to give the impression that my perception is that the only people who are involved in developing cyber thoughts, whether it's opportunities or security, are the Cyber Command. But I don't have a problem with that. I would make one point. I think we're at a point in history where security being a hit on the bottom line is outdated. And I'll tell you why. If I'm right that one of the central characteristics in approaching the cyber environment, in a doctrine or outside of it, is the need for constant innovative entrepreneurial thought and change, that is also the central principle of economic growth in the modern world. And therefore, rather than being a hit on the bottom line, the fact that that central principle applies both to security and growth should allow it to be a catalyst to the bringing together of public and private sectors, and the recognition that in the cyber environment in which we now live, there is no longer that artificial distinction between the two. Opportunity and security are actually related in a way they never were before we get into the cyber environment.
Thank you. Mr. Wong? A question about Cyber Command and the Chinese view towards that in the United States?
I think as far as China's view on the United States government, I think at first China has not enough capability to deal with the cyber security challenge, and it whether from the technology or all the capability, it's even the legislation and the other things. China has enough experience and technology to deal with it. So I think the cooperation is more important than the confrontation. But several reports from the ICCE and the other institute of United States government, and always said China launched the cyber attack and China cyber spy, and what influenced the intention of China's cooperation. And second, in fact, China was attacked by the cyber is much more than United States. But the same to you, I don't know why Chinese demonstrate. I'm the victim. In recent, there is a hack organization act the China's government website against the China internet block. But I think it's such means will improve the China's further block on the internet, because China government has the excuse, oh, it's for the practical challenge, so I have to adapt the more consultative approach to deal with it.
Okay.
So
Thank you. Gavin? Yep. Jan?
Yeah, it was clear that everywhere in the world the cyber security knowledge consolidation was going on. So actually this creation of the cyber command wasn't really any kind of surprise. The only surprise was that why it took so long. No, it's quite clear that you have to be what you're doing in this game is you are building better working collective brain. So it is also clear that somewhere you must actually situate these nucleus and you have gathered those people together to work together effectively. So it was very logical.
Okay. Greg, the last word.
You know, I think we do need to recognize that others in the globe do see the formation of Cyber Command as a threatening, development. As a former military officer, the imperative to do it for the reasons that Jan just put are there. I'm not second guessing the decision, but the perception globally, CSIS did a study of who's the most threatening nation right after the formation of Cyber Command. The U.S. managed to come out #1 in that study. So I think the broader question is, the militarization of cyberspace, right? Which many, and I am sympathetic, may see as inevitable, and therefore you need to deal effectively with that. But the United States and many of its friends and allies are the most empowered nations by the nature of it, by a stable, cyberspace that isn't fraught with crime and disruptive activity. And, I think we've got to worry about the perceptions of things and avoid arms racing sorts of phenomena. So I just wanted to put the cautionary note in there that certainly my experience globally is a lot of questions about why Cyber Command, should we have one too, and we certainly see other nations creating similar organizations.
Great, thank you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, General Hayden, and panel number 4. We made it to the end of the day. So I'm going to keep this brief. I want to thank, first, our sponsors for today, because it wouldn't even be possible for me to try to put this together. And importantly, the speakers and the panelists that stuck with us the whole day, and you all that came and sat here and talked and asked questions and listened. I was taught a long time ago, trained as an intelligence officer, but a boss of mine, George Tenon at the time, told me that if there's something that bothers you or you have some kind of gut sense of something, keep looking, keep asking questions until you get to the point where you're satisfied. And so a couple years ago, when we were discussing I was discussing with the private sector and the government, the difficult questions of cybersecurity, I thought one of the hardest problems would be international engagement on the topic. So last year, I convened the first meeting and tried to make it as international as possible. And this year, I tried to do it again. I'm still not satisfied. I still think that we could do more. Each year, I become more impressed and certain that we can do more as I meet more and more of the individuals that come here and speak. So I will continue to try to impose myself on everybody and others and bring them again back here to come together and talk about the issues. I hope that with each year and a lot of other things happening in the meantime, that we all the world of nations start making progress on some of the difficult, thorny issues that have been raised today. So once again, I want to thank everybody, and I actually finished early today. Of course, we skipped a lot of bathroom and coffee breaks, I've been told. But we will have a reception. So right after we leave here, I'd welcome you back to where the registration tables were for a reception to wrap it up today. So thank you. Thank you very much.